You're a 15-year-old princess in the sprawling Ottoman palace of Topkapi. The year is 1650, and tomorrow you're supposed to marry a powerful governor you've never met. But tonight, as you try to sleep in your silk-draped chambers, you can hear the whispered conversations of the palace physicians in the corridors outside. They're preparing instruments, discussing procedures, and making arrangements that fill you with a dread you don't fully understand yet. You know that before you can become a bride, before you can leave these palace walls, you must endure something that generations of Ottoman princesses have faced before you. Something so invasive, so humiliating, that it will haunt you for the rest of your life. The palace calls it a medical examination, but you've heard the older women whisper the truth. It's a virginity test so brutal and degrading that some princesses have chosen death over marriage rather than submit to it. What you're about to learn isn't just another tale of historical medical practices. It's the story of how an empire's obsession with female purity created a system of institutionalized torture that masqueraded as royal protocol. The Ottoman Empire, which ruled over vast territories for more than 6 centuries, developed virginity testing procedures so extreme and psychologically devastating that they make medieval torture chambers look merciful by comparison. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. The Ottoman palace wasn't just a seat of political power, it was a carefully orchestrated theater where every aspect of life was designed to reinforce the absolute authority of the Sultan and his dynasty. Within these walls lived hundreds of women, from the Sultan's mother to his wives, concubines, daughters, and female servants. But it was the princesses, the Sultan's daughters, who occupied the most precarious position in this hierarchy of female subjugation. These young women were born into unimaginable luxury, but also into a prison of expectations that would define every moment of their existence. From the day they could walk, Ottoman princesses understood that their primary value lay not in their intelligence, their personalities, or their dreams, but in their potential as political bargaining chips. Their marriages would seal alliances, their children would strengthen bloodlines, and their bodies would serve as proof of the dynasty's honor. But before any of that could happen, they had to prove their worthiness through a series of examinations that were as much about psychological control as they were about physical verification. The Ottoman court physicians, working under direct orders from the Sultan's mother and his chief advisors, developed procedures that went far beyond simple medical examinations. These were elaborate rituals designed to break down a young woman's sense of personal autonomy and replace it with complete submission to the will of the empire. The preparation for these examinations began weeks before the actual procedure. Palace servants would start whispering about the upcoming marriage, and the princess would notice subtle changes in how she was treated. Her movements became more restricted, her meals were monitored more carefully, and she would find herself under constant supervision by older women, whose job was to ensure she remained pure until the examination could take place. During this waiting period, the psychological torture was often worse than the physical examination itself. Young princesses would lie awake at night, imagining what horrors awaited them. They would seek comfort from their mothers or older sisters, only to be told that this was simply the price of royal blood, the burden that came with their privileged birth. The message was clear: resistance was futile, and acceptance was the only path to survival. The actual examination took place in a specially prepared chamber deep within the palace complex, far from the living quarters where other residents might hear what transpired. The room was decorated with expensive carpets and filled with the scent of burning incense, creating an atmosphere that was simultaneously luxurious and deeply sinister. Multiple physicians would be present, along with several palace officials whose job was to witness and document the proceedings. What made these examinations particularly cruel was their performative nature. This wasn't a private medical procedure conducted with discretion and compassion. Instead, it was a public demonstration of the empire's power over its most precious possessions. The princess would be required to disrobe completely while surrounded by men and women who treated her body as state property rather than as a human being, deserving of dignity and respect. The physical examination itself involved procedures that modern medicine would recognize as both medically unnecessary and potentially dangerous. Ottoman court physicians had developed their own theories about female anatomy and purity. theories that had more to do with controlling women than with actual medical knowledge. They believed that a woman's virtue could be determined through visual inspection, manual examination, and tests that required the princess to endure positions and procedures that were designed to maximize her humiliation. But the true horror of these examinations lay not in their physical invasiveness, but in their psychological impact. These young women, raised in luxury and treated as precious jewels, suddenly found themselves reduced to objects to be inspected, tested, and approved like livestock at a market. The trauma of this experience would follow them into their marriages, affecting their ability to trust, to love, and to see their own bodies as anything other than tools for political purposes. The documentation that survives from these examinations reveals the clinical detachment with which palace officials approached what should have been the most private aspects of a young woman's life. Detailed reports were compiled, noting every aspect of the examination, every reaction from the princess, every determination made by the examining physicians. These documents were filed away in palace archives, creating permanent records of these intimate violations. What makes this historical practice even more disturbing is how it was justified and normalized within Ottoman society. The empire's religious and legal scholars developed elaborate theological arguments to support these examinations, claiming that they were necessary to preserve the purity of the royal bloodline and to ensure that marriages would be blessed by divine approval. The psychological preparation didn't end with the examination itself. After enduring this ordeal, princesses would be subjected to additional procedures designed to ensure their continued purity until their wedding night. Palace physicians would provide detailed instructions about behavior, diet, and activities that were permitted or forbidden, creating a prison of rules that governed every aspect of their daily existence. This systematic dehumanization of Ottoman princesses represents one of history's most calculated examples of how political power can corrupt and distort the most fundamental aspects of human dignity. These weren't isolated incidents or the actions of particularly cruel individuals. They were institutionalized practices that continued for generations, affecting hundreds of young women whose only crime was being born into positions of apparent privilege. The most chilling aspect of these examinations was how they evolved over time, becoming increasingly elaborate and invasive as successive generations of palace officials sought to perfect their methods of control. By the 17th century, what had once been relatively simple procedures had transformed into multi-day ordeals that pushed the boundaries of human endurance and psychological manipulation. The evolution of these practices reveals the twisted logic of institutional power. Each generation of palace physicians believed they could improve upon the methods of their predecessors, creating more thorough, more reliable, and more humiliating ways to verify and control female purity. They developed specialized instruments, crafted detailed protocols, and established hierarchies of examination that turned the violation of young women into a sophisticated science. One particularly disturbing innovation was the introduction of what palace records euphemistically called preparatory treatments. These involve subjecting princesses to weeks of dietary restrictions, herbal preparations, and physical conditioning, designed to make the eventual examination more thorough and conclusive. The young women would be fed specific foods believed to affect their internal condition, forced to drink concoctions that would alter their physical responses, and subjected to treatments that modern medicine would recognize as both dangerous and completely unnecessary. The psychological conditioning during this preparation period was equally systematic. Palace officials understood that a princess who accepted her fate would be easier to examine and less likely to cause problems during the procedure. They developed techniques for breaking down resistance that were remarkably sophisticated for their time. Princesses would be isolated from sources of emotional support, subjected to lectures about their duties and obligations, and gradually conditioned to see the upcoming examination as an inevitable and necessary part of their royal destiny. The actual examination rooms were designed to maximize the psychological impact of the experience. Every detail was carefully planned to reinforce the power dynamic between the examining officials and the princess being tested. The furniture was arranged to ensure that the young woman felt exposed and vulnerable from the moment she entered the space. Mirrors were positioned to create a sense of being observed from multiple angles simultaneously. Even the lighting was calculated to create shadows and highlights that would emphasize the clinical nature of what was about to occur. The examination process itself typically lasted several hours and involved multiple phases, each designed to test different aspects of the princess's condition. What made these procedures particularly cruel was their repetitive nature. The same tests would be performed multiple times by different physicians, supposedly to ensure accuracy, but actually to maximize the psychological impact on the victim. Each repetition reinforced the message that her body belonged not to her, but to the empire, subject to inspection and verification at will. The most disturbing accounts come from palace records that describe the reactions of the princesses themselves during these ordeals. Some would faint from terror and humiliation, only to be revived and forced to continue. Others would attempt to negotiate or plead for mercy, not understanding that the officials conducting these examinations saw themselves as performing a sacred duty to the empire. The most heartbreaking cases involved princesses who had clearly been broken by the experience, accepting their violation with a resigned passivity that spoke to the complete destruction of their sense of personal autonomy. But the examination was only the beginning of a princess's ordeal. Once the physical verification was complete, she would be subjected to what palace officials called the certification process. This involved the creation of detailed documentation that would follow her for the rest of her life, serving as official proof of her worthiness for marriage and her value as a political asset. These documents were written in clinical language that reduced the most intimate aspects of her existence to bureaucratic data points. The certification process included the creation of official seals and signatures from multiple palace officials, turning the princess's most private moments into matters of state record. Copies of these documents would be sent to the family of her intended husband, shared with religious authorities who would oversee the marriage ceremony, and filed in palace archives where they would remain as permanent testimony to her submission to imperial authority. Perhaps most tragically, these examinations created lasting trauma that affected every aspect of a princess's future relationships. The young women who survived these ordeals often developed what modern psychology would recognize as severe trust issues, sexual dysfunction, and chronic anxiety. They entered their marriages carrying the psychological scars of systematic dehumanization, unable to experience intimacy without remembering the clinical detachment with which their bodies had been examined and documented. The ripple effects extended beyond the princesses themselves to affect their relationships with their husbands, their children, and their understanding of their own worth as human beings. Many developed an internalized sense of shame about their bodies and their sexuality that would persist throughout their lives. They had been taught in the most visceral way possible that their value lay entirely in their ability to serve the political needs of the empire, and this lesson was reinforced every time they looked in a mirror or experienced any form of physical intimacy. The systematic nature of these practices reveals something deeply disturbing about how institutional power can corrupt basic human decency. This wasn't the result of individual cruelty or sadistic impulses. It was the logical outcome of a system that viewed women as property and treated their bodies as resources to be managed and controlled. The fact that these procedures were conducted by trained physicians, blessed by religious authorities, and documented by educated bureaucrats shows how easily civilized societies can rationalize the most barbaric practices when they serve the interests of those in power. The story of Ottoman Princess Virginity tests stands as one of history's most chilling reminders that privilege and power are not always what they appear to be. Behind the silk curtains and golden walls of Topkapi Palace, young women born into apparent luxury faced a systematic destruction of their humanity that would haunt them for life. These weren't isolated acts of cruelty, but carefully orchestrated rituals designed to transform human beings into political commodities. What makes this history particularly haunting is how easily a civilized empire rationalized such barbaric practices. The Ottoman court convinced itself that these examinations were medical necessities, religious obligations, and political requirements. But the truth was far simpler and far more disturbing. They were tools of control, designed to break the spirit of young women before they could even begin their adult lives. These forgotten princesses deserve to be remembered not as symbols of imperial power, but as victims of a system that valued their bodies over their souls. Their stories remind us that throughout history, the most vulnerable members of society have often been those who appeared most privileged, trapped by the very status that seemed to protect them. As we look back across the centuries at these young women who faced such unimaginable ordeals, we honor their memory by refusing to forget the human cost of unchecked power, and by recognizing that true civilization is measured not by its palaces or conquests, but by how it treats its most defenseless members.